Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think that we're about to start. I'm not sure I see other people still coming in, but we want to get going and stick to schedule. I'm Hugo Gurdon. I'm Editor-in-Chief of the Washington Examiner. Thanks very much for coming. As you know, the program is going to start with a couple of panel discussions, and then we're going to have Secretary Chao joining us in a little while, and I'll be interviewing her. I do want to thank the Heritage Foundation for opening up this great facility to us and combining with us in doing that. And I'm going to ask Rob Bluey of the Heritage Foundation just to come up and say a few words and introduce the first panel. Thanks very much.
Well, good morning and welcome to the Heritage Foundation. My name is Rob Bluey and I'm the Vice President of Communications and the Executive Editor of the Daily Signal, which is the Heritage Foundation's multimedia news organization. On behalf of my colleagues, I'd like to thank Hugo and the team at the Washington Examiner for bringing us an outstanding lineup of speakers today, which does include Secretary of Transportation Elaine Chao, who will be with us later this morning. Every day, the Heritage Foundation holds important events with respected and influential leaders and policy experts like you'll hear today on some of the most important topics that our country is facing. The events are part of Heritage's mission to formulate and promote conservative public policy solutions based on the conservative principles of free enterprise, limited government, individual freedom, traditional values, and a strong national defense. Heritage, as you may know, is the most broadly supported institution dedicated to public policy research and education, and we strive to get this analysis and our recommendation into the hands of decision makers in Washington and opinion leaders across the country. That includes members of Congress, the Trump administration, the news media, academics, and the policy community. And certainly we're striving to do that on the topic that we're discussing today, which is infrastructure. We hope that you will tweet about today's event, but we do ask that you silence your cell phones so there are no interruptions. We also want to let you know that for those of you who may be viewing online, the full video of this event will be available on the Heritage website later today or within 24 hours. And to kick off today's discussion, I'd like to welcome my friend, Tim Carney, who is the commentary editor at the Washington Examiner. Tim and I have known each other for well over a decade. Tim was here recently to talk about his new book, Alienated America. Tim, please join us and introduce our first panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So why don't we just call up Nicole, Nick, and Kim, and I'll introduce you guys in a second. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to Infrastructure Week. We've been looking forward to this for a while. Infrastructure was a thing that all pundits after the election, when we were in this fractured state after the 2016 election, they said, will Democrats and Republicans be able to work together on anything? And a lot of people said, well, infrastructure. Why? Well, Democrats like spending money, and Donald Trump likes having things built and sees himself as a builder. So we were supposed to get something. We haven't gotten something yet, and well, policy always proves more complicated in practice than in promise. And that's the complexity of this is why we assembled the excellent panel we have today. Anybody who follows stuff about transportation, infrastructure, the way cities works, follows Nicole Gelinas. She is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor at the City Journal, and a columnist at the New York Post. Then we have Nick Loris of the Heritage Foundation. He's an economist, focuses on energy, environment, and regulatory issues. He's the deputy director of the Thomas Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies. And finally, we have Heritage Action's Tim Chapman. Tim's the executive director at Heritage Action, and they've been polling on this issue about infrastructure and transportation. So thank you, panelists. I just want to start off and ask in general, do we need a $2 trillion infrastructure bill? And if so, what specifically should be in it? Nicole?
Thank you, Tim, and I want to thank Hugo for having us here today. The answer to do we need a $1 trillion infrastructure bill or a $2 trillion infrastructure bill is no. The answer to do we need an infrastructure bill is yes. But the problem is when we focus on these big numbers, we don't get to the goal. We saw this with the Obama era stimulus, where this was billed as a nearly $1 trillion infrastructure bill. Obama used the word transformative when he rolled this out in early 2009, but many of the projects in the bill never came to fruition. If you think about a high-speed rail network, where President Obama said at the time, we're going to build a backbone of a new transportation network across the country, but the marquee project of this high-speed rail network, the high-speed rail spine up and down California, they have built barely anything now in more than a decade since this was announced. And so to get to real infrastructure, the last thing we need is to put the number first. The first thing we should be doing is having all 50 states and the major regional areas in each state put together a realistic list of what are their immediate infrastructure needs that are actually achievable within the next decade. Then, how much do those infrastructure needs cost? Then we arrive at a number that is more realistic than $1 trillion or $2 trillion. And then we get to the hard part, which is actually executing these projects. We are very good at announcing projects and making press releases and press conferences, but we're not very good at getting them done. You know, you remember the old Seinfeld joke, it's easy to make a car reservation and take the car reservation. It's much harder to actually have the car there waiting for you once you go to retrieve your reservation. And we're the same way with our infrastructure projects. It's the execution that will matter in the end.
Yeah, to build off Nicole's last point, I mean, when you think about what President Obama said when he passed that stimulus package and then those projects didn't come to fruition, he said those shovel-ready jobs weren't as shovel-ready as they initially anticipated. And a big part of that was the regulatory obstacles that we face when building infrastructure. I mean, think of just one single project like the Keystone XL pipeline. I mean, if you look back to when TransCanada announced that they were going to expand their Keystone system with XL down to the Gulf Coast, Barack Obama hadn't even announced that Joe Biden was his running mate yet. If you had a child on the day that TransCanada submitted its application to the State Department, that child would be entering middle school this September. I mean, that is wild. And that's just one pipeline project. If you expand that to all of the infrastructure projects that we have, whether it's traditional infrastructure projects in highways and bridges, if it's energy infrastructure projects like pipelines, even renewable energy infrastructure projects are all facing these systemic regulatory problems, whether it's labor regulations, environmental regulations, just outright NIMBYism, sporadic changes in zoning laws. All of these things adversely impact the ability to actually build things and to get the projects that we want here to meet the consumer's needs.
I agree with both my fellow panelists here, but let me try to answer the question from a little different perspective. The question is whether we need $1 trillion or $2 trillion infrastructure package. It depends on who you ask. And we asked a lot of people. We've done a pretty significant amount of polling this year at Heritage Action. The backdrop to what we're trying to do in the polling project is we're looking at the political coalition that brought Trump into power in 2016, and that coalition we see as suburban Republicans, grassroots conservatives, and working class Americans. And working class Americans were new to the coalition and came in because they liked what a lot of things that Trump was saying, specifically on issues like infrastructure. And so we've done almost $500,000 in polling this year to look at these different areas. We've polled nationally, we've polled in battleground states, we've polled in blue-collar districts, we've polled in suburban districts. And what you see is that overwhelmingly there is an appetite for an infrastructure program. When the infrastructure program is described as roads and bridges, we're not talking about mass transit, we're not talking about this kind of thing, but roads and bridges just overwhelmingly popular. Now that probably doesn't surprise a lot of people. But if you look at just within the Republican base, registered Republicans, you ask them a very simple question: do you support a $1 trillion federal spending program for roads and bridges? The answer is 78% support that within the Republican Party. So the point here is that, and then the numbers go up when you start looking into those blue collar districts and the competitive districts. So you understand why members of Congress are so in the Republican side, and we wonder why conservatives are so excited to sign on to an infrastructure bill. It's because their constituents are. Now look, the numbers go down when you talk about, well, do you support this bill because if it gives sweetheart deals to labor unions, or if there are contracts where there's corruption and things like that, the numbers obviously fall through the bottom. And so there is a way to fight back against some of these massive bloated federal bills. But my point is that this is a politically salient issue that will probably come if Trump is reelected, and will be one of the first things that they try to do. And so conservatives, I think, have to figure out how to be a part of shaping this, because if we don't shape it, if you just let the administration shape it, and you let them work with Democrats to cut the deal, it's going to end up looking a lot different than we would like it to look. So we need, and that's the importance, I think, of this panel too, and what we're talking about today is what does that actually end up
Well,
looking
so
like?
exactly, when people say they support an infrastructure bill, three different people would have three different things in mind. When Nancy Pelosi was asked about it, she said, it's about jobs, jobs, jobs.
Yeah.
She said something about economic efficiency and then throws in saving the planet.
Yeah.
Donald Trump, when he talked about it in the State of the Union, if I remember what he said, we will build gleaming new roads across, and bridges and roadways and railways and waterways across this land. So that's very Trumpian. It shines, right? Like gold. But when you're polling people, I don't know, if you're asking me about infrastructure, I'm thinking maybe you're going to, fill some potholes. Or
Yeah.
maybe you're going to add one more lane, or maybe you're going to add a sidewalk. So don't we mean 13 different things? So should Congress sort of pick something and focus on it? Is this something for the states to decide? Nicole, what would you do if somebody said, where should the infrastructure money go?
Yeah, I think that's the first question, is what is infrastructure? And the reason that we see some of these big numbers, the engineers come out every 3 years with their big report that we have a $3 trillion infrastructure deficit, but that is based on an overly broad definition of infrastructure. So the first thing we need to do in coming up with a number, do we need $1 trillion, do we need $2 trillion, pulling these numbers out of the air, is what is the role of the federal government in paying for infrastructure? That's the number that we should be thinking about. Most infrastructure is private sector infrastructure, or it is local and state infrastructure. If we think about pipelines, if we think about electricity, if we think about water, these are all things that are paid for through people's utility bills, whether private sector, if you have a private sector electric company, or through your municipal water bill. Except for in extraordinary circumstances, a very poor town, for example, they pay for themselves. You pay your electricity bill, that money covers the cost of paying for the electricity capital plant as well as all of the employees. There's really no need for government involvement except with some of the regulatory issues. Same thing with an oil pipeline, a gas pipeline. If it does not pay for itself, there's probably something wrong with it. We should listen to that market signal that there's not enough demand for the project, that the cost of building the project are too high, and so forth. Much of the rest of our infrastructure, local potholes, local road and bridge maintenance, these are state and local issues. 3 out of every 4 infrastructure dollars are spent at the state and local level. And there's some ideas out there about making more of our highways into tolled highways. We could talk about that a little bit later, and some of the positives and negatives of that. But the infrastructure that doesn't pay for itself is, in general, your larger network road projects where there is a federal role, your larger mass transit projects, the Gateway Tunnel, for example, dam projects to protect against flood control because there's no efficient mechanism to get everyone to pay for their share of the dam. So these are the things that we're talking about. It's a much smaller universe than the broad utilities part of it.
Yeah, and I think a big problem is that 4 of the $4 aren't going to those types of projects. And generally, right now, we have a infrastructure spending system that incentivizes the siphoning of federal resources to go to projects that are state and local in nature. It's kind of like when you go out to eat with a group of your friends. If you go out to eat with a group of your friends and you can split the bill among 10 people, your buddy who usually gets a side salad and a cup of soup when he's paying for the bill is all of a sudden ordering a cowboy ribeye and slinging back $14 cocktails because he knows he can spread the cost among 9 other people. And that's what you get with these massive infrastructure spending packages, is you're spreading the cost among all of the millions of taxpayers, and then you get wasteful projects or projects that are simply local or state in nature, and you have things like spending on bike paths and recreational trails. And that's not to denigrate the value of those projects. I love biking and I love recreational trails, but I think the people who derive the most value from using them are the ones that should be paying for them.
So, Tim, let me ask you, does your polling sort of go granular as to sort of what the priorities are, whether it's new versus maintaining, whether it's roads versus bike trails, et cetera?
Yeah, we listed, and I'm not going to remember the exact numbers right now, but we listed different categories of infrastructure spending: roads and bridges, mass transit, bike trails, those kinds of things. And it was overwhelmingly that roads and bridges are what people thought infrastructure spending was. So, I think if Republicans are going to do this right, they need to begin talking now about what they're going to do in 2020 if the president is reelected. And I think to do it right, they actually have to shift the ground that they're debating the Democrats on. Because you're right, I mean, Nancy Pelosi talks about this as a jobs bill. It's a popular political message. That's how I'd be talking about it if I were her. Republicans need to kind of take a step outside of this traditional debate, which has been about what is the federal government going to do and how much is the federal government going to spend on a big infrastructure program, and say this is bigger than infrastructure. And I would talk about this as a jobs and a work program. I would recommend that the president say, look, here's what we're going to do. We're not going to play on the Democrats' turf. We're going to do an infrastructure program that empowers states and localities. We're going to have public-private partnerships. But this is not just infrastructure. This is more than just roads and bridges. This is about putting this country back to work. And there's a host of other areas that he can kind of dovetail into this when it comes to work and the dignity of work. And this is important, especially for that part of his coalition that he won. I think a lot of you probably saw the Axios piece yesterday morning that showed that a lot of the flip districts that went for Obama before they flipped and went for Trump are doing less well in terms of the economic recovery than other districts across the country. I mean, he still needs to be making the case that he's helping the working class American. And so we have all sorts of policies here at Heritage that we've been championing, things like higher education reform, where you put on par the federal subsidy that you give to people who go to four-year liberal arts school, and say if somebody's going to go get vocational or apprenticeship training, you can also receive that federal subsidy. So this is like Pell Grants, things like that. That is, why should working class Americans be subsidizing mostly upper middle class Americans who all receive federal funds and go to four-year college degrees? Put that in an infrastructure bill. Put welfare reform in an infrastructure bill. Put skills-based immigration in an infrastructure bill, and change the debate. Make the debate actually something that is broader and captures the public's imagination in a way that I think the Democrats cannot compete with. When they're trying to fight on higher education, they're going to get beat. Their interests on higher education are completely regressive. You see what Elizabeth Warren is doing on her bailout for higher ed. You see what Bernie Sanders is doing. So I'd like to kind of attack it in that way, and that allows you to actually push a lot of the spending down to the state and local level, but the bigness of the bill allows you to still be broad and aspirational.
Well, it seems that I've never seen Republicans win a fight of who will spend more money, including to create jobs.
Right.
Do you think an infrastructure bill could or should be a jobs bill?
It should only be a jobs bill in the sense that better infrastructure makes the private sector more productive. We think about infrastructure the wrong way when we think it should create public sector jobs or heavily subsidized construction industry jobs. Of course, it's wonderful that jobs are a byproduct of building infrastructure, and people who work building infrastructure, engineering infrastructure, these are important jobs, but that is not the point of the infrastructure. The point of the infrastructure is to support the private sector. Now, of course, these jobs should pay whatever is necessary to attract qualified workers, but one of the issues with infrastructure bills is the state issue of prevailing wages. In New York, for example, state law says that if you are working on a public works project, the wage for a basic laborer is close to $50 an hour, but the health care and pension benefits above that go into the hourly wage bring the cost closer to $100 an hour. And as you go up the scale of the skill of the work, operating engineers, carpenters, electricians, plumbers, the wages go up even higher. No, there's nothing wrong with that. These are good, solid middle-class jobs, but the other side of the prevailing wage laws is the inefficient work rules that are embedded in these contracts between the construction contractors and the construction unions. For example, if I've got a job that requires plumbing, electricity, and painting, I need 3 separate people to do these 3 separate jobs, even if the work is incidental in any one of these areas, that you just need someone to hook up the plumbing, you just need someone to hook up the electricity, it's not complex, skilled work. You still need 3 separate people on the job site. There's a lot of inflexibility in these union contracts.
I remember being at the Republican convention in '04 and getting yelled at by a union guy because he said, "You're not in the IBEW, yet you're doing electricity distribution." Now, I'm a reporter. What I was doing was plugging in an extension cord. And he showed me that I was doing stuff that only union workers were allowed to do.
Yep. And that's not to say, we want to throw away the unions and get rid of these jobs. It's just to say that any federal infrastructure bill has to nod to the reality that we need, first of all, these contracts need to be made public. Right now, the contracts between construction contractors and construction unions are considered private contracts that the rest of us can't see, even though part of our money goes to pay for it. And once the contracts are public, we need to see a lot more efficiencies in terms of the workforce productivity so that we're getting more infrastructure for every dollar that we spend.
So let me ask you, saying that the way infrastructure creates jobs is by supporting business, allowing more efficient shipping, commuting, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And that gets back to the question of, well, then how should we fund it and who should be paying for it? If it's creating economic opportunity, then the people for whom it's creating economic opportunity ought to be paying for it, right? And there's a million debates over how we fund roads. I'm from New York, and most highways are tolled. Almost every bridge is tolled. But you go down south, and tolls are, that's the least. I always think, what's your least popular opinion? I think we should pay for highways with tolls. But so is there any way to do that politically? Do you think that's best? How would you guys pay for infrastructure? Nick?
Well, yeah, I think part of it would be through the private sector, to the extent that the private sector should be investing in these projects like energy infrastructure. It makes sense to remove those burdensome regulations to allow the private sector to invest in these projects and create the value that's necessary to meet America's energy demands. For when we spend public dollars, we can do a lot also to just stretch those public dollars further by reforming things like Davis-Bacon and by getting rid of things like Buy America provisions, so we can actually stretch those public dollars that we allocate even further. And then I think the biggest fundamental shift that we should have is to shift those decisions to the states and significantly reduce the federal government's role to those projects that are federal and national in scope. And then if states want to tinker with raising their own gas taxes, if they want to introduce tolls, if they want to introduce their own state-based VMTs, which we're seeing at the state level, and some of these have been successful, if there's some local or regional resistance to tolling, I think that's the most economically efficient way to
You said
handle these things.
VMT,
Yeah. No, sorry, vehicle
explain.
miles traveled tax. So instead of a gas tax, to compensate for more electric vehicles that are on the road, it would be based on vehicle miles traveled rather than
And
a gas tax.
the state looks at your odometer at the end of the year? Or?
Yeah, there's different ways to do it, but essentially that's one way to do it. And there's generally some concerns about privacy issues there, but I think those can be worked out. Oregon is a state that's introduced that, and I think with a lot of success. So I think that's where you see the laboratories of democracy creating different ideas, some of which are popular, some of which are not. But the more we have those decisions being made at the state and local level, rather than one federal level and raising the national gas tax, the more we take away those decisions that should be made at the state level.
Cole, I imagine you have opinions on this. So.
Yeah, I'll give you an example of one success story that has very little to do with the federal government before I get to some of the political issues with the vehicle miles traveled toll. You remember a few years ago, Joe Biden came to New York and he stood with our Governor Cuomo and he said that LaGuardia Airport is like a third world airport, that LaGuardia is an embarrassment to the country, and this points up why we needed the Obama era infrastructure bill. And lo and behold, half a decade or so later, we are building a new LaGuardia Airport, and we're also building a new JFK Airport. And so to the casual observer, this would appear that federal spending resulted in these new airport projects. But if you look at the details of the projects, there's really no federal involvement here. The New York airports, they throw off a $500 million a year profit. And those profits are what is rebuilding the airports. This is essentially a real estate deal. The airlines have decided passenger traffic, passenger revenues are high enough that they can support a complete rebuild of these airports. And so the airline money is going to build new terminals, better infrastructure around the airports. This is essentially a coalition of airlines that have agreed to pay for this, spending the money through the by-state port authority. There's really no taxpayer money involved in this. It could have been done 10 years ago, it could be done today. It really just depends on the airline's outlook for does the traffic and does the revenue support this. Now, that's a success story, but it doesn't involve a massive federal infrastructure bill. We're doing this without and before the federal infrastructure bill. And I'll just make one point about some of the political issues about the vehicle miles traveled way of paying for highways. This is something that sounds very economically sound because it is. Why should people who choose to live far away from their jobs because they can get a bigger house if they go out a few more miles and so forth, why should everyone else subsidize these people? But the problem, or the practical problem, is this is also how you get like a yellow vest movement in France, where the practicalities of who lives far away. Well, a lot of people live far away because they can't afford to live closer to work. And so you get into the issue of, are you suddenly changing the rules of the game after people have made their decisions on where to live, where to work, and so forth? And when you're looking at a vehicle miles travel toll, suddenly slapping a $2,000-3,000 a year tax in the eyes of who is paying for it, a big tax on the middle class that people feel like they have no way of escaping. They can't immediately change their behavior in response to this market signal. I'm not saying this is good, this is bad, this is neutral. I'm just saying that this is no doubt something that is going to come up in any bigger discussion of VMT.
And do we have polling on gas tax, tolls, the popularity of those things?
People are willing to pay a higher tax for infrastructure. Yeah, and we've seen that consistently in the polling. I mean, like I completely agree with my colleagues here about how to pay for it. I want to back up just a second and make sure I'm clear on what I was proposing earlier. I'm not trying to outbid the Democrats on this. I think we have a couple challenges as conservatives. One is that the administration themselves are not high on a kind of public-private partnership approach to this, and they are not high on a federalist approach to this. I think we have work to do there, and we need to convince them. We also know that the Democratic Party is going to just try to spend a $2 to $3 trillion infrastructure bill, and it's all going to be top-down, and they're going to market it as a jobs bill. I think we can beat them politically if we are saying, yes, jobs is a very important part of this. Work is a very important part of this. The dignity of work is something that we as conservatives believe in. But you do not give people dignity in their work if you're just creating a, quote, shovel-ready job that may disappear or won't be shovel-ready. Here's the way you create dignity in work. And we've got the policies on that one, whether you're talking about welfare reform or the higher ed stuff or the vocational training. It's okay to reinvigorate the idea that not everybody needs to have a 4-year college degree, right? Or that you can have a trade and you can provide the American dream for your family. I like fighting on those terms when we talk about infrastructure. I think it may not be the right way to go, but I think we need to be creative, or else we're going to just get in. If we're not creative, well, then we will get into the bidding war with the left. If it's just about how much is the federal government going to pay on this, we'll end up losing that.
And it presents a great alternative to the jobs training programs that we've seen that have been tried and failed in other stimulus-style packages. I mean, if you look at the green jobs programs that were part of the stimulus bill that were supposed to get people back to work and train people for the next generation of work, I mean, they overwhelmingly failed. I mean, the retention rates were dismal. You were training people who already had the training. And so this presents a very productive counter-narrative to these jobs training programs that we're likely to see in some of these bills.
So I guess when you always get the question of sort of why can Europe have high-speed rail, or why can these places do these things that we don't? The LA Times had an answer the other day. They said, well, the problem, and you guys talk about public-private partnership, they say the problem is they rely on these contractors who are greedy and rip them off. When you look at New York City's inability to build that Second Avenue subway in any reasonable time, conservatives say the problem is regulations, union laws, environmental regulations, that sort of thing. Nicole, this is the sort of thing you've looked at sort of on a granular level. So walk us through sort of why we can't have nice things infrastructure-wise.
Yeah, I like rail, but we have a very difficult time building rail in this country. And even if you look at what is considered our high-speed rail success story, the Acela train from Washington up to Boston, it costs $600 a lot of the times for me to go on the Acela round trip from Washington to New York. I can fly across the ocean sometimes for cheaper than it takes to take the Acela. Why does it cost $600? Because the customers taking it are all heavily subsidized. They either work for the federal government, so they're paying for this train ride out of their federal expense check, or they're doing some kind of lobbying, some kind of business down in Washington where they don't really see the costs of the train ride. And I'm not saying it's not successful, but if you were to say, should I take my family of 5 for a trip down to Washington to see the sights and go home? It's very convenient. You can get there quickly. It's a nice trip. But if you were thinking of spending $3,000 to take 5 people back and forth to Washington, it just doesn't work economically. And that's a very big difference from Paris or France or Germany or even Britain, where a high-speed rail trip, 4-hour, 5-hour trip, could be $50 one way. It's a much more casual, unsubsidized trip. Now, what are some of the reasons for that? European construction contractors are far more efficient than the American market. And so part of what we need to do in rebuilding New York's rail system, building a new tunnel under the Hudson River, is we need a much bigger, more competitive bidding pool. One of the problems is that on our projects in New York, we often have only 1 bidder, maybe 2 bidders, the same old bidders who have done a bad job on previous projects.
So why is that? And when I hear that, I think like the mafia, are they knocking off their competitors, or?
Well, part of the problems is that global contractors are put off by these Byzantine regulatory issues, work rule issues, prevailing wage issues, hiring through the union halls, because they just can't manage the project. And on the rare times that they've bid on projects. They've actually lost money on some of these projects.
But again, if we're comparing to Europe, this is confusing because when I think of Europe, I don't think of the land of sort of liberalized labor force and low government footprint.
The labor environment there is not as adversarial, unions versus everyone else, as we tend to think of it. It is a much more collaborative environment where in return for social safety net and so forth, the workforce is far more productive on some of these infrastructure projects. And so that is something to think about. It is not considered a massive jobs program because people feel comfortable that this is infrastructure and that this supports private sector activity.
If you were to do one or two reforms, Nick, to get infrastructure projects going better, what would they be?
I think the biggest one would be to just outright repeal the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. I mean, this has been the growth of the regulatory state in such a way where these projects, where it used to take, a little over 2 years to go through an environmental impact analysis, has almost quadrupled. And I don't think anything sucks away consumer confidence like being in this excessive regulatory burden of a state, as well as just an excessive culture of litigation as well. So I think.
So explain what NEPA does to the whole process.
Yeah. So I mean, for any project that involves federal funding, and it needs to go through a permitting and environmental impact analysis, which is done through multiple agencies. And so you have a lot of activity that's done by multiple federal agencies that have crossover roles and responsibilities, or it's supposed to be delineated, but that's often not the case. So there's a lot of confusion as to who's doing what at what time. In a lot of senses, it's duplicative of what state environmental regulators could already do. And so you've seen an increased amount of paperwork for not much more environmental benefit. I think decreasing marginal returns when it comes to environmental benefit. And so this has been one of the holdups of infrastructure for a long time now. It's over 50 years old. When the Obama administration had all of their projects, they gave categorical exclusions to over 179,000 different projects, which demonstrates that we can build these projects in a way that's environmentally safe and without this cumbersome environmental review process. That's not to say we shouldn't have any environmental review process, but it's been essentially used as a tool to block and delay infrastructure projects that people might not actually want. And so I think the Trump administration is making some important regulatory reforms on NEPA, and that's productive. I think codifying those things would be great. Essentially, repealing NEPA would be ultimately better. I don't think that's going to happen, but if we could codify some of these reg reforms that the Trump administration is pushing, I think that's a very big win.
Well, so I wanted to talk about the political possibility of doing something, and that doesn't sound like something a Democratic House would go along with. I mean, just in general, starting with you, Tim, what are the political odds of passing something through a Democratic House and a Republican Senate? Should we wait till 2020? What's your thoughts on this?
I do think that this should be something that Republicans present early before the election and then try to do after. You got to win the mandate. I actually think that there are. I was having dinner with a couple congressmen last night, and they were talking about a lot of their more moderate Democratic colleagues who were willing to bend a little bit on some of the labor regulations, on some of the local regulations, because they've seen the on-the-ground impact of it. So if you just look at, you mentioned, I think you mentioned the New Yorker piece that was on the transit issue in New York City, and how it was way worse than what's happening in Europe. That piece went all over New York. And so New Yorkers of all stripes are frustrated with the fact that they can't get their transit system up to snuff, and that you can't get a train out of town in time, and that if you live in a certain borough outside of town, you're in trouble 50% of the time on the way in. And people are starting to understand what the issue is. And so I think we have some illustrations that will be helpful to us. But look, at the end of the day, we can't sugarcoat it. You have to win the conversation. And so I don't think you can win the conversation without actually starting the conversation. And that's where Republicans need to be right now. They need to be thinking about what kind of infrastructure package are we proposing first. And it should not be one that, I don't think that they should be proposing an infrastructure package that makes the concessions early on. You want the concessions to be completely left out of this package.
So you're saying make a bid now,
Yep.
push it with the hope that with electoral victories in November 2020, you can pass it after.
Yeah, I was to mention to you, I have a piece in the Examiner this morning, which is trying to make the argument that the administration has to be thinking right now about what the argument for 2020 is. And one of the pieces of that argument really should be infrastructure. They run the risk in this election of kind of trying to just revert back to form in 2016 and rerun the greatest hits of 2016. They'll probably lose if they do that. He still has a reservoir of strength within his base, but he has to give them something that they're looking forward to in 2021. And this is a huge issue for the base.
Now, if you look back at March or April or May, there was happy talk of, Trump and Pelosi working something out. Was there ever something that was going to work out? So politically, what could happen? What advice would you give lawmakers, et cetera? Nicole?
I think practically speaking, the bad news is that the only way that this is going to work out is through a lot of pork barrel trade-offs.
Buy off enough lawmakers.
Yes, if you look at what a place like New York wants, New York politicians do not want to touch any of the union rules. The construction contractors, the construction unions, they don't want these construction contracts public and being looked at by the public, obviously, and so we can see all of the inefficiencies that are embedded in some of these agreements. But on the other hand, you have Florida, you have Texas, you have South Carolina, you have places where the real estate industry is basically dependent on nationally subsidized flood control infrastructure. And so everybody has their own, not very pure free market interests that they want protected. And so the infrastructure bill that we get may just be more of the same.
Yeah, that's my fear too. I mean, if you look at some of these antiquated laws and policies, even things, that affect our ports, like the Jones Act that prohibits any foreign-built ship or operated ship from delivering goods from U.S. port to U.S. port, or the Foreign Dredge Act that doesn't allow foreign dredgers to come in, that would actually allow our ports to be bigger, more economically robust.
Are we afraid they're going to plant little mines in the harbor?
Unfortunately, yes. That's the fear mongering that you get from for protecting a lot of these policies. But to Nicole's point, there's just a lot of concentrated benefits of these policies, and then the costs are dispersed amongst the rest of us as taxpayers and as consumers. And so it makes it very difficult, politically speaking, to make any movement on some of these policies that are outdated and antiquated.
All right, so I'll wrap it up with one round of questions for you guys, or one question for all of you. So again, Donald Trump in the State of the Union talked about gleaming new infrastructure. I remember Newt Gingrich running for president talking about his various moonshots, and Obama was going to, his precise words was remake America, not rebuild, remake America in his inauguration. So I'm a conservative guy. I don't really get excited about big, bold, new government projects, but politically, maybe there's demand for it, and maybe we need them. So do you guys have moonshots in mind, or do you share my suspicion of moonshots? How would you think, if you were to do something big and bold, what would it be? Or would you not do something big and bold?
Well, I think, unfortunately, we live in a world where you have to do something big and bold. And especially with this president, he's not going to settle for, a very modest, small infrastructure bill. Which is why I'm suggesting we change the terrain and think about this debate a little bit differently. He also said in his inaugural address that I'm here to take power from Washington, D.C., the swamp, and give it back to the American people. That was one of the best riffs he had in the address, and that was a nod towards federalism. They have not followed up on that as much as they should. That is big and bold. especially in today's day and age. I think you have, as you and I have discussed many times, you have so much political tension and so much political fighting at the federal level, and a lot of people are looking for ways to turn the temperature down. Do that in the context of an infrastructure bill. It's a good first step. It's big and bold. Say we are going to fulfill that promise that we did, and we are going to empower local governments and state governments to do what they need to do for the American people, but we're also making this about work, and we're also making it about the dignity of being an American, being able to raise your kids, being able to get a vocation or an apprenticeship that actually provides for that. I like that approach.
Nick?
Yeah, about 2 years ago, a former colleague of mine who worked on transportation policy and I put out a paper that said, how do you get to over $1 trillion in private infrastructure and stretching those public dollars further? So I think if you want to go big and bold, that's where you need to start. It needs to look at all of those fundamental reforms from a regulatory standpoint on environmental regs, on telecoms regs, on labor regs to get to that $1 trillion number. If you want to put a big, bright, shiny number on it, focus less on the federal taxpayer spending that money and more on the private sector spending that money. And then having a serious conversation as to if we are going to spend federal dollars, how are we going to pay for it, making sure that there's offsets or if there's the right type of reforms that actually do stretch those public dollars further.
I was hoping somebody was going to have a bridge across Lake Michigan or a high-speed rail underground through a little tube from LA to San Francisco,
not too late, Nicole.
or
It's
at
not
least
gone
a
yet.
gleaming wall for 1,970 miles of the U.S.-Mexico border. So do you have any of those for me?
Yeah, I do. My big bold project would be build our tunnel under the Hudson River. It's an interstate project. This is how hundreds of thousands of New Jersey commuters get to work. These can be swing voters, but they are desperate for competent government. How can we do this? Do it in a different way with the environmental regulations, with the labor contracts being made public. Do it through a public-private partnership where there is a fixed date for it to be completed, there's a fixed budget. The federal government rewards the project for meeting or exceeding these budget and transparency standards. Because if we do this right as a demonstration project, it could be a model for other big, bold projects.
All right, everybody, join me in thanking this panel for.
In our second panel, we have people who are more engaged in the practice of this. So first we have Brigham McCown, who's a former senior executive at the Department of Transportation and currently is in business and philanthropy, CEO of a DC firm here and chairman of a nonprofit focused on innovative solutions for issues involving infrastructure. And we have, Marty Noe. Marty. Okay, Marty Noe is a supervisor on the Prince William County board there, and he's the chairman of the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority. So thank you guys, and let's welcome our two new panelists.
Thank you. So there's tons of things to talk about. We're the warm-up act for Secretary Chao now, but thank you both for coming. But I'll start you guys with the same question I started the last panel with. Do we need a $1 trillion or $2 trillion federal infrastructure bill? And if so, what would you want to see in it?
Okay, thank you, and thank you for inviting me today. Great first panel, and I was thinking about that as I was sitting down here for the first panel. We have a significant infrastructure issue. I mean, I think everybody agrees that our infrastructure is showing a lot of wear and tear. The issue's always been, how are we going to pay for it, and what's the federal role versus what's the state or local role? So do we need a substantial amount of monetary infusion into our infrastructure? Uh-oh, I may be off.
No, you're fine. Yeah.
That answer is yes. Does the federal government and does the taxpayer need to pay for it? Largely, that answer is no, and we can get more into that.
We will. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I would say that obviously the challenge is always the same. How do you pay for what you say you need? There's no question that the investment needs to be made, though. As someone who comes from the local government side but deals directly with transportation, this concept of crumbling bridges and insufficient capacity on highways and transit systems that don't work the way they're supposed to work is a very serious and real problem, and it is hindering economic growth. In places like Northern Virginia, but also any place where you've got a lot of economic activity going on, increasingly we're seeing the number one impediment to business growth is the lack of good investment in transportation and other infrastructure that makes it possible for people to get to work and go make money.
And so then, yeah, we'll move to the paying for question. How should it be paid for? And I know that there's 100 answers. Give as many as you can. How would you pay for this?
Okay, sure. Well, number one, and the previous panel mentioned this, when we talk about infrastructure, we really need to subdivide it into different categories. We have energy infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, social infrastructure, but if we're talking about transportation infrastructure, I firmly believe, and the department has been working very hard to actually push a lot of those decisions with federal oversight, but push those decisions down to the state and local area. And if you think about it, when we've gotten rid of earmarks, we didn't really get rid of earmarks. We got rid of a lot of the congressional mandated earmarks, but now we have bureaucratic earmarks, we have administrative earmarks, and the secretary has a lot of discretion on where that money goes. We have been working very hard at the department. She's been working very hard at the department to make sure that those decisions are based on needs and based on qualifiers. But quite frankly, my concern is I don't know what's going to happen when the next people come in, and there's just as much room, if not more, for diversion to projects that don't make any sense. So how are we going to pay for it? I think there is a federal role. I would like to see a more limited federal oversight role, actually. You've seen a lot of the states increase their own gas taxes and look at it. The big issue is going to be, and this is something that I just don't think House leadership and even the Hill leadership is really going to want to get into this cycle, is the Highway Trust Fund is not sustainable. Right now, we've talked about the guy that orders the last panel talked about the guy that orders the big steak. Well, the hybrids and electric cars are free riding to some extent on our highway transportation.
They're not buying gasoline, so they're not paying the gas tax.
They're not paying. And now we've gone from a user fee to just throwing general fund money at the issue. And that is not, again, a long-term sustainable. We have the diversions, almost 20% out of the Highway Trust Fund for transit and other issues. These are the big topics that we really need to be getting at. I frankly don't see the political will this time around to do it, but that disruption is coming, and more, as cars become more efficient, at some point there's going to be a tipping point, and whether it's a VMT or something else, we're going to have to get to that.
But there are political arguments for both of the things you talked about, saying, well, the electric cars don't have the externalities of the pollution, for instance. That is one of the reasons that maybe they shouldn't pay as much. And then as far as the diversions, people say, well, if you're building public transit, well, that, for one thing, is alleviating traffic. So these are sort of defenses of what you see as flaws in the program. Do you think those are flawed defenses?
I think they're huge flaws, and you may not agree with me, but let's keep in mind that until the 70s, transit operators, that was not a public enterprise, that was private, and the government was forced to come in and take it over. And to the point, if it's not sustainable, it's costing us money. And what we have right now is a huge divide between urban and suburban and rural. And that is only going to continue. And I think, quite frankly, we do need to move toward a user fee-based system instead of a subsidized system, because we are losing a lot of efficiency in the way we're currently doing things.
I think when you talk about it, like you talk about transit, for example, in that regard, he's absolutely right. I mean, there has been, the shift is complete. We're not undergoing a shift. I mean, transit agencies were private companies, or at least sort of freestanding agencies that were created by the government but then sort of pushed aside to go do their own thing. It doesn't function like that anymore. One of the challenges that the urban jurisdictions throughout the country are dealing with is sort of this bottomless pit of how do you put enough money into transit. I think one of the challenges that we deal with is that there's this tension when it comes to any kind of transportation, but particularly when we're talking about public transit, between whether or not it's a mobility service. Is this a way to get people to jobs or get people home from work at the end of the day, get people to the shopping center so they can pick up groceries, et cetera? Or is it a social safety net program, right? And I think, and as sort of the local public official, well, the answer is yes, it's both. There's no question that if that working class, lower income family doesn't have reliable transportation of some form, they're not going to get to work. They're not going to be able to pick up the kid from daycare. And then there's a spiral that comes with that, right? You make the problem worse. Then the question becomes, so how do we prioritize it? Are we prioritizing it as a mobility service? And is it competing, therefore, against road investment? Or are we prioritizing it as a social safety net service, in which case it's competing against, the food assistance programs, for example, right? And I think depending on where you're from and what your political ideology is, has an impact on how you think about that. I think when we're talking about a federal infrastructure bill, if it's a federal infrastructure bill, then it has to be about mobility, right? If what we're doing is trying to move people around, then you have to prioritize those investments that move the most people. Now, is that transit investment? Is that road investment? Well, depends who you're trying to move and where you're trying to move them. The needs in the national capital area are very different than the needs in Houston and are very different than the needs in Tacoma, Washington. Pick your cities. The needs are going to be different, but you have to be looking at, if we're going to make big moves, you have to be looking at prioritization that says, what has the best return on investment for the state or the locality where that investment is being made?
But so if it's a good investment, shouldn't it pay for itself? And thus, that's an argument for sort of a user fee. There's always talk about widening the roads in Northern Virginia, and I was like, well, if it's economically valuable, then it should pay for itself, and there should be no reason to tax other people to come in and pay for it.
Right. So great question. So this gets into the question of, well, is it better to collect taxes from people today to pay for the future use, or is it better to find ways to make the people who are going to use it in the future pay for it? And of course, the answer is that the company that builds the road or builds the rails or builds the train car that's going to sit on those rails, they want to be paid today. They're not interested in waiting for the tolls or the user fees to come in. Here in Northern Virginia specifically, where I happen to be from, we have been making major investments in what they call HOT lanes, where they can be single occupant vehicles can pay a toll, or high occupancy vehicles can ride for free. Some people love it, some people hate it. I paid a pretty big toll today to make sure I got here on time. Still got here a little bit too late, right? But that is probably from a perspective of linking who pays to who receives the best benefit. That is one effective way to do it. It gets a lot of pushback from people who say, well, wait a minute, my taxes paid for this road 40 years ago. Now you're adding an additional lane and going to toll me to be on a road that I already paid for. Sometimes the answer ends up being, it's either this or we do nothing at all and your situation continues to get worse. But I think finding ways to pay for improvements over the life of that improvement, whether it's a highway or a transit system, is the better way to go. Unfortunately, the business model out there for these things doesn't always lend itself well to making that happen.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that, I think sometimes we tend to think that we have a one-size-fits-all solution. And not just in transit, but with interstate highways or roads. And, what works in Northern Virginia might not work in Dallas, might not work in Cincinnati. And just like we don't have a single tool in our toolbox, if we try to apply a hammer to every single thing we used, it wouldn't work out very well. It would work out great sometimes, it wouldn't work out. You need different tools. And that's sort of the complexity of the transportation policy that we need to get into. I, for one, typically like the idea that things should be self-funding, sustainable. You should let the market decide. And what the government has done through attempts at good policy to some extent has been to remove transparency, which then keeps money on the sideline, keeps investment because risk is just so adverse to those who want to invest. And then two, we tend to pick winners and losers sometimes, right? We tax what we don't like and we subsidize what we do like. And so the market then becomes skewed. I really think, and something that the Secretary has been working very hard at, is to try to level that playing field, let everybody know what the rules are, and then get out of the way. And, for example, DOT has, President Trump has a 2-for-1 regulatory reduction. DOT is leading the way at 15-to-1 right now. Nixon 15 for every one. And what that is starting to let the gears turn again, and we've seen a substantial amount of private investment leaping into these things, as well as state and local money in order to build these projects. But that's a little more theoretical.
Yeah, I want to get to more of the nitty-gritty of how public-private partnerships work and ought to work. But first, since you brought up regulations, what are the most important reforms, deregulations, et cetera, that can be done that would stimulate, free up investment in particularly transportation infrastructure?
Yeah, I think a couple. One is on the financial side, picking how these investment projects work. DOT is charged with not only doling out money, but making loans. So that process has been significantly streamlined and taken a much harder look, and they need to continue to take a much harder look at the viability of the projects when they come in. You know, I think we tend to say and think under federalism, those decisions are best, closest to where the decisions are being made, yet you know, the federal government's sort of been seen as the piggy bank, or the nationals mayor, sometimes the secretary's called. Everybody comes in, you know, wanting a handout, and her response is great. Let's look at your plan. Let's look at how much money what kind of skin in the game are you bringing to the table, and we can help use federal monies to leverage you and get you over the hump to do that last mile. But, you know, when I first joined the department, I don't know, 20 years ago, somebody came to me and said, sir, we have a problem. I said, great, what's the problem? And they told me what the problem was. I said, how are we going to fix it? They said, well, I need $25 million. I said, to do what? He said, to fix the project. And I said, well, okay, let's stop and back up here, because we do have this tendency in D.C. to think if we just throw money at something, it's going to get fixed. And in the second part of your question, the environmental permitting and streamlining, and the previous panel mentioned it. You know, I worked on the Keystone, I've worked on DAPL, I've worked on some of these projects. You know, crying out loud, we put a man on the moon faster than we can figure out whether or not we need a pipeline. And NEPA has gotten to the point where you can it's never enough. If you don't win, you sue, and another truckload of papers is not going to change a decision. So having a federal government that prioritizes a single lead agency for the environmental reviews and gets them out. If Germany, which is progressive, can figure out whether or not to build something in 2 years, it ought not take us 10 or 12.
I think one of the challenges, and again, I come to this from the perspective of a local government, but a local government which makes very big investments in transportation, which is unusual, at least in Virginia it is, where generally local governments are looking to make the decisions about the interface between land use and transportation, but then looking to the state or federal government to provide the funding. My home locality, we have our own local construction program that sort of competes against the state program. But we have essentially this rule, and this is exactly this point, one of the challenges we have. There are important projects that would get people to work faster, improve everyone's quality of life. They're cost effective. They're the right investment in the right place at the right time to solve the right problems. And then we find out that the only way to get it funded is through a federal program. And then we'll say, you know, let's go build a different road someplace else, right? There was a discussion we had actually at my local board meeting just last night about a project where someone said, well, could we bring the cost down by seeking state funding or federal funding on this? And I said, no. I said, it's a big project. I said, this is a $300 million project that turns into a $450 million project if we have to take federal money and take with it all of the strings that come attached to it. So, I mean, one of the things that has to happen is whatever happens with the next federal infrastructure round of infrastructure investment, a piece of that absolutely has to be making it more feasible for states and localities to use those investments to actually solve the problem that needs to be solved. And that doesn't mean that we want to ignore the importance of protecting wetlands or protecting historical resources or protecting endangered species. We want to pay attention to those things. But if what we end up doing is spending all of the federal money on a project on complying with federal regulations in a way that doesn't actually improve the quality of the project, it's better off just to use state and local funds to pay for it.
So you're turning away free money because the money comes with too many strings and it's not free anymore.
Well, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And again, we've had good projects go from what should be a 2-year project to become a 10-year project, or we've had roads that should become 4-lane roads get built as 2-lane roads because the compliance becomes too difficult. And again, if that compliance, if those regulations add value, if they improve the quality of life or they improve the way in which we're taking care of our natural resources, well, then that's something we need to do. But it's something we would do whether or not, in my case, it's something we would do whether those regulatory regimes were in place or not. So how do we streamline that? How do we simplify that? And get rid of some of the old thinking on this and be able to think more innovatively.
So, speaking of thinking innovatively, sometimes when I think about a place like Prince William County or Loudoun or something, and the thought is, well, we need to be able to reduce the congestion of all the people trying to get into DC or maybe Arlington. But to some extent, congestion is like a price signal, right? Some people won't move to Prince William because there's so much congestion. So if you then add another lane, well, then more people will move to Prince William. It's one reason why the developers in Northern Virginia were the first ones to lead the cause for, more statewide funding, that sort of thing. So aren't there 1,000 other answers? We sometimes say, telecommuting or have more jobs in Prince William rather than have the people. So how do you think about that? Because governments are so likely to think, well, we just need more lanes.
So that's a great question. So just coincidentally, last night my local board agreed to put on the ballot for November a referendum for a $335 million bond referendum for local investments in roads. The biggest piece of that is a road, for those who aren't familiar with it, Route 28, which is the most congested corridor in all of Northern Virginia, which is the most congested region in the country. This has become the sort of the center of gravity for bad traffic in the Mid-Atlantic. And by the way, it happens to run right through the middle of the district that I represent. But we're making a big investment in that. The thing that I find frustrating is it's an investment we absolutely have to make. But it is an investment that is about moving people from my community into a different community to go to work, where they will be creating jobs someplace else. The rest of that bond referendum we're putting forward and the rest of the requests that we're making from the state agencies and the Regional Transportation Authority, of which I'm chairman, are really more projects that are about moving people around the county better. Because I think that in highly, and again, Prince William County, my home county, Loudoun County, which is just to our north, even in Fairfax County, which is more part of the core of Northern Virginia, the conversation really has shifted from how do we shorten people's commutes rather than easing people's commutes. I think, so national news surrounding the decision to locate Amazon's HQ2 in Arlington. And it's a big deal, right? It's 25 to 35,000 jobs that are going to come over the next 10 years. One of the things that Amazon made real clear was that they were only going to go to a place where their employees could get to work on transit. They recognized that dropping that many jobs in any place in the country all at once was not going to be solved with more lane miles and more exit ramps. So again, the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority and the state are making big investments in transit because, going back to the previous point, those are the investments that have the biggest impact in this situation. And I think the notion of not looking for a one-size-fits-all, the notion that somehow every problem can be solved by
So
widening
in
the
this
road.
situation, because there's already so many lanes, or why is this a situation that calls specifically for more transit?
So using Amazon coming to the Crystal City area in Arlington County, first of all, there's no place to put additional lanes there. You couldn't literally. I mean, the existing right-of-way ends at the edge of the buildings, right? I suppose you could add a little bit more space to 95 if the Defense Department doesn't mind the highway getting closer to the Pentagon, which they mind, by the way. So there is no opportunity to build more lanes there. But the reality is, to your point, that wouldn't have solved the problem, right? Add more lanes, you put in more cars, but all you're doing is diverting people from one mode to a different mode. It's about looking at the situation and saying, there's not a one-size-fits-all. There's not a single solution that solves everything. Now, let me say, that's a frustration, by the way, coming from a more suburban jurisdiction when I see a big chunk of money being invested in transit systems inside the Beltway, which means there's not a lot of money left to invest in roads outside the Beltway.
I, for one, think they should extend the yellow line all the way down to Alexandria and the blue line out to Franconia Springfield. That's my idea.
Well, and so what I get hit with all the time is extend the blue line down to Woodbridge and the orange line out to Manassas. We don't have that kind of money doesn't exist, you know.
Yeah.
So my answer is a little simpler. Move to Texas, where I am. We've got plenty of room for everybody, and low cost of living, pro-government, pro-economic growth policies. But you know, I think this goes back to sort of what I was talking about earlier at the 30,000-foot view. Is that different jurisdictions have different requirements. However, you know, if I go to Ohio, where I'm from, and I tell people as they're gassing up, hey, Chicago Metro Transit thanks you. WMATA thanks you. You're like, what are you talking about? I said, you're subsidizing people in the Bay Area taking BART down to Silicon Valley. You're subsidizing people that work on Wall Street. Now, yeah, are you subsidizing folks that need to get to work with hourly jobs? Absolutely. But again, the funding system that we're using is inefficient. And from an innovative standpoint, the day of reckoning is coming. I don't think it's here yet, and I don't think there's enough political courage or will in the Congress to change the funding mechanism this time around. But whether it's the additional the Highway Trust Fund falling off or other models, when disruption happens, remember Kodak. Kodak was like this massive company. When I grew up, it was worth a lot of money, right? And they did one thing, and they did it very well. Now they're basically gone, right? Because they didn't anticipate the disruption that was coming to their industry. Transportation disruption is coming. We're not there yet. You know, autonomous vehicles, 90% of the time, they make really good decisions. The 10% of the time they need to make a really awesome decision, they're horrible at it. So I, for one, don't think autonomous vehicles are coming quite as quickly as a lot of people do. But all these changes are coming, and they're going to fundamentally disrupt our mobility and how we get to work, where we work from. 5G broadband in rural areas is going to change the need to come into the cities. So all this is coming, and it's something that we need to be thinking about. I just got back from the SpaceX launch. It was fantastic. That's a hugely disruptive trillion-dollar industry where somebody's figured out a way to boost twice the payload for a third of the cost that the government can do it. That's coming to transportation. I just don't think we're there yet.
So as far as funding, so yeah, we fund highways and other stuff through a gas tax, and a lot of it, and the industry lobby for the most part is calling for a more gas tax. The Chamber of Commerce, that's been like their most consistent position for the last decade, is raising the gas tax. But again, to me, there seem to be a lot of flaws with that. Some people are talking about the vehicle miles traveled. Sometimes this involves a GPS. I don't necessarily want my state government tracking where I'm going. I mean, I guess Apple and Google already are, but you don't need to add a third onto that. And then the subway systems here in D.C., you pay more if you live farther out, which makes sense, except if you look at the red line, you start at Tacoma, my side of the red line, you start at Tacoma, each stop you go out, the median income falls, and each stop you go out, the price of the commute goes up.
Yeah.
And so there's no easy answer to this, but you're talking innovation. So what would you guys see as far as specific ways to innovate?
So I think the notion, and he touched on this, the notion that, you know, rural broadband is going to change a lot, okay? Because suddenly it will become possible to do a lot of jobs that used to require driving into an office or commuting into an office literally in the middle of a farm field in Nebraska. The day will come. We're not there yet, but the day will come on that. I think the other thing is that we have to think about is how do we use technology to use our existing infrastructure, specifically transportation infrastructure, more efficiently. I hear a lot about the notion of, well, driverless vehicles are going to make the need for roads obsolete. I don't fundamentally agree with that. If all that happens is we get in our single occupant car and let the computer drive us to work rather than using the steering wheel, we're still one person in one car.
But we'll be able to tweet more while driving.
We'll be able to tweet more, exactly, or read a newspaper because, you know, we got a fancy car.
I'm very into reading newspapers and magazines. Everyone in this room should do that.
Yeah, exactly.
frequently.
That's what I always love to see is people who sit with their books on the subway and I want to say, someday we'll be able to read a book in the car, but then the car will just read the book to you. But I think though that, like, for example, autonomous vehicles could have a huge impact if I knew how to make this happen, I would be making a lot more money than I am as a local elected official. But if autonomous vehicles create a new culture of ride sharing, right? That there's this autonomous vehicle that serves as a little microbus and picks people up near each other and takes them where they want to go. And how does it know that they want to get there? Well, again, we haven't figured that out yet. I think the other piece where autonomous vehicles can change everything is actually in the trucking industry. I think, I know lots of people I've met lots of people in my life who have done long haul trucking. They are not interested in only driving from 8 at night until 5 in the morning and then having an opportunity from about 10:30 to about 11:30 to drive more, right? An autonomous vehicle has no problem, an autonomous tractor trailer has no problem getting off of the road when traffic is heavy and then getting back on when traffic lightens up. That could be a big change, right? The ability, again, technological solutions, this ties into the land use piece, the ability of people to share work without having to be in the same space. So that essentially the people who are physically proximate to each other don't have to necessarily be working on the same project because that can be done virtually. And I think the tension there is, I still believe that despite all of the great things that broadband can do for us, human beings still like to interact with other human beings. I get told a lot, well, you went to such and such a meeting and you sat in traffic to go to the meeting. Why wasn't the meeting done as a conference call? And the answer is, because if it was done as a conference call, I would have put it on mute and then done email while I'm sort of listening to other people talk.
And this was a promise. I mean, this is what we were being told in 2000. Reason Magazine, a competitor of ours, and I hold them in high regard, but their crazy libertarian idea in 1999 was to have no actual physical office. Everybody's going to work remote. I mean, this was on the path towards the libertopia where they all become, just ones and zeros or whatever. And then they decide after a few years, you know what, you actually need to get people together in a room to create a good work environment. So, I mean, high-speed rural broadband, to me, sounds like the same promise that was being made to me 20 years ago. Yes, some people will be freed up to telecommute, but the idea that this will dramatically cut down on commuting, is there any reason to think that that would change now?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I will say this, and I see it with my teenagers. I would say that the availability of 4G connectivity in our homes has created this generation of introverts, right?
Yeah.
That there's a much bigger percentage of the population under the age of 35 who are more comfortable being physically by themselves or happier being physically by themselves than people in my generation, Gen Xers were and are. But I do think that part of what makes us human is the social interaction, right?
Yep.
I don't think that's ever going to fundamentally change. I do think that we may be evolving, or some might call it devolving, in terms of that interaction can take place digitally. I heard an observation one time, I don't remember the circumstances, where it may have been a scene from a movie where two people were looking at two baby boomers were watching a Gen Xer sit in a coffee shop with his phone in front of him, and one of them said, it's so terrible that these people look at their phones all day. Don't they ever want to interact with other people? And the second baby boomer said, what do you think they're doing on that phone? They're interacting with other people. So maybe over time our brains get rewired a little bit to mean that human interaction doesn't always have to mean physical proximity. But right now, and for this foreseeable future, teams are able to work more creatively when they're in the same space. But the flip side to that is there are some people whose role is to be by themselves, and that's where their job requires being by themselves. Those people don't have to sit in the office every day.
So innovation on either funding or transportation that you think is coming or would be really earth-shattering?
Well, what I would like to see coming versus what I think is actually not going to happen. Let me start with that. My line is, I don't think we're going to get a big infrastructure package this year. Let me zoom back up to 30,000 feet. I just find it hard to believe that the congressional leadership is willing to hand President Trump a significant victory moving into the 2020 election. Yep. No matter how they do it, and they can try to claim equal credit, but I frankly don't see that happening. Now, what has happened is the Congress has plussed up the transportation budget $10 billion a year the last couple of years, and that has given the Secretary a lot more fuel to push out to the states and to try to do that. And a lot of people have been coming to apply, yet Other states, like you've mentioned, during the Obama years, Ohio just quit applying for grants. They're like, we're not going to get them, so why apply? But the funding mechanism needs to fundamentally change. When I was in the Bush administration, we looked at a gas tax increase, and we're told, no, that's a tax by President Bush. We were said, well, why don't we index it for inflation? We were told, no, that's a tax. But the realities of life are that concrete, steel, and asphalt cost a lot more than they did the last time it was indexed when President Clinton was in. We really do need to bump up the gas tax, at least for short term. I wouldn't be opposed to tying it to inflation. You could phase it in, or you could phase it back down if things got tight and the economy went south. But we're going to have some public spending, whether we like it or not, in the short term. And then what we really need to be looking at are these long-term solutions, because again, things are going to fundamentally shift, and the current mechanism we're using, billed as a user fee, isn't working. So whether that's congestion pricing, value pricing, or VMT, getting everybody to pay, I'll use a Democratic term, make sure all those on the roadway are paying their fair share. We need to look at that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that I don't know what it looks like, but that has to be the concept. I heard one of the things we talk about when we talk about a housing policy is the notion that you can no longer look at median incomes versus median household prices and make a good decision about whether you have the right mix of housing in a community. What you have to look at is median incomes and a combination of median household income and median transportation costs. Because essentially what happens is you have to be very careful about not making investments in transportation infrastructure that simply allow people to move further away from their jobs and buy a cheaper house. Because then those of us who chose to live kind of in the middle are subsidizing the folks who chose to live out in the country. Oh, but that's okay because the folks who live in the urban core are actually probably subsidizing me at that point. But that's bad policy, right? That we need to figure out how to look at the entire sort of market structure around these things and make good decisions. I think one of the challenges, and I think that Secretary Chao is probably doing a better job of this than we've seen in the past, but we like to talk about how we got rid of earmarks because we're going to take the politics out of the decision making. Well, but we didn't really take the politics out of the decision making. We just moved the politics from the legislative branch to the executive branch of the decision making. And I think that we're seeing that problem get a little better, but there needs to be a more radical fundamental change, that the decision making needs to be based on data and analysis for what is most cost effective in achieving the goals, rather than what makes sense because it feels right today.
And so we've touched on the theme of federalism and local control here, but I guess how would you describe the right mix of federal funding and what the federal role is if you got to if you got to stick reforms into an infrastructure bill that ends up passing, what would they be? Should anybody in Virginia be paying for roads in Mississippi? Should people in New York be paying for roads in Virginia? How would you describe sort of what you think is a proper structure of this? We'll start.
Yeah, I think there is a federal role. Clearly, there's a federal role in putting together the overarching rules of the game, if you will. There's also a need to spend federal money, whether it's the state parks on federal lands. If we want a valid national infrastructure transportation system, we're going to have to subsidize roads in certain states. Otherwise,
like what? Why should I pay a Marylander pay for roads outside of Maryland?
Do you buy anything on Amazon? Do you go to Starbucks? Do you rely on the supply chain network? We need those through roads. Otherwise, there's no incentive for North Dakota to build an interstate highway that connects the East Coast with the West Coast.
And so shouldn't those roads pay for themselves? So that if I'm buying for it on Amazon, I'm paying for the roads because the trucker's paying the toll.
Well, ideally, every road should pay for itself. The question is, how do you quantify that? And, I had a chief economist, and I said one day in government, what do the numbers say? And he looked at me with all dead seriousness and said, what do you want them to say? So, how we analyze the analytics is really important. Yes, everything should pay for itself, and I think we can all get lured into this NIMBY. How does the Keystone Pipeline help me? I'm not, through there, and it does, because we live in a worldwide integrated system, and we have to do a better job of explaining that to people and selling it, Just like, transit removes people from the roads, et cetera, we have to look at that. There is a federal role. I believe in partial devolution, pushing more stuff back to the states. I think it's strange that we take somebody else's money, hold on to it, lose some of it, and then hand it back to them, right, for our cut. And, but the federal government could do a much better job of helping people build a 100-year bridge, a 50. We can build asphalt right now with lane lines in it that will never need to be repainted. You know who's opposed to that? People that paint the lane lines, right? But you can bake the lane lines into the asphalt at multiple layers. Never have to do this again. There are things we can do that the federal government can help the state and local governments do. And but as your previous panel said, most infrastructure money, 75 to 78%, is already raised and spent at the local level. And I'd like to push that up more toward about 85%.
Yeah, I think that there's absolutely a role for the federal government in these things. Like, I'm a local government official. I actually think the federal government should be paying almost all of it. And we, the local government, should just focus on schools and police departments, right? But that said, I think that one of the things that can happen is a recognition on the regulatory side that says that very often the agencies that are building the infrastructure using federal money are agencies whose primary function are things like elementary schools and police departments and fire stations, right? So if you're a large urban jurisdiction, you may have a very professional transportation infrastructure department. I was just involved in a project to build a $12 million traffic circle to accommodate 12,000 trips a day, 12,000 daily trips on a 2-lane road that was first constructed in the Revolutionary War, out just on the edge of a town with 132 residents, right? The mayor gets paid $1 a year in this town. He doesn't have a public works director. And literally, the mayor himself attended all of the scoping meetings and all of the engineering meetings because there was no one else to represent the town's interests, okay? But he's going to transform his little tiny historic town based on this in a very positive way. Making it easier for transportation capital organizations to create transportation capital instead of focusing on complying with a big, thick rule book. That's the biggest change that has to happen. And I think that what we'll find is the amount of dollars that the federal government has to put in actually will buy a lot more stuff and a lot more good stuff if you let the people who actually understand what the needs are and can actually demonstrate that the investment is going to provide the ROI that we're looking for actually do their jobs.
Do you guys think that when could you possibly expect an infrastructure bill, and what do you think shape it would take? I mean, is there any chance of Democratic House and a Republican Senate passing something? You already said no.
Yeah, I agree. It's difficult to imagine a big infrastructure bill before November of next year. It's just hard to see it. But what I will say is, maybe what's happening is we've lived in a time. It's been 20 plus years that we've been living in this culture of the solution to everything is to get mad about it. Ask me my opinion on any topic, and I will say I don't know which one justifies the most rage, right? Then that's my opinion. Maybe the American people are on the precipice of getting tired of that way of governing, and it doesn't matter who's in the White House, and it doesn't matter who's in control of Congress, regardless of what the structure of government has been. It's been about conflict is the solution, right? Maybe the American people are ready to say, no, we actually want you to solve stuff, and I would guess I'd call on everybody watching. Call your congressman, tell him you want him to solve stuff rather than fight with other people about things. And I think that's a culture shift that seems nearly impossible. On the other hand, every big culture shift like that that's ever happened has happened very quickly. So maybe we'll get a call tomorrow. I don't know.
April 2021.
April 2021.
Yeah, that's going to be my take.
Because Republicans take over the House, or?
Well, I think regardless of what happens in the House, I think President Trump will get reelected. I think at that time, people on both sides, whoever's in the House or Senate, will be ready to go. That being said, I just kind of in conclusion, we sometimes think that Congress has to pass a law to fix something, sometimes they should not be doing anything, right? And, or should be undoing what it is they've done in the past. And, you know, we've had the plus-ups in the spending. More is getting done with the roadways. And so this notion that we have to have a massive infrastructure bill may not necessarily be accurate, or it could be broken down into smaller things. I'd actually like to see a 10-year bill. The first highway bill was a 13-year bill. And think about that, because again, you need stability and consistency over time for private investment. And that's what we didn't really get to talk about today, but that's the other golden arrow that we have in the quiver, is that private money to put in.
All right. Join me in thanking this panel. Thank you, guys. Please welcome out here Hugo Gurdon, my editor-in-chief, and Elaine Chao, the Secretary of Transportation. Thank you.
Have a seat. So, morning, Madam Secretary. First of all, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We're delighted to have you, and both sides of the aisle seem to be keen on having an infrastructure bill, but there doesn't seem very much life in the possibility of a bill right now in legislation. Is it the case that, as President Trump suggested after the breakdown of talks a month or two ago, that it's rather difficult to have two tracks going on, infrastructure on the one hand and Democratic investigations on Capitol Hill? Is that, you know, can the two happen together? And, you know, how optimistic are you about moving infrastructure forward?
Well, the president has always said that he wanted a bipartisan effort in addressing the deteriorating infrastructure conditions of our country. This is actually an issue that should be done on a bipartisan basis. So there was high hopes that this could be, you know, a bipartisan effort. But clearly, it's been disappointing that the administration put forward its proposal last year, and we want to work with Congress, so we hope to hear from them, you know, as to what their ideas are for addressing the deteriorating infrastructure of our country. Because it's so important, you know, infrastructure impacts productivity, economic vibrancy, economic growth, and the quality of life for our citizens and our residents.
Really?
Thank you. I guess this did not work.
I'm sorry about that. You know, Chuck Schumer said that the president is looking for an excuse not to do infrastructure. I mean, is that the impression that people have in the administration?
Absolutely not. Mentioned, the president is very focused on the need to address the deteriorating infrastructure in our country. That was something that he talked about way back in 2016.
Right.
And infrastructure really should be a topic that there is bipartisan support. So we want to work with the Congress. The administration put forward a proposal last year, and we want to engage in dialogue with the Congress and have them come back to us as well.
One of the big issues about that has come up for discussion this morning is the headline figure of $2 trillion that both sides of the aisle were talking about a couple of months ago. Can you address from a kind of conservative point of view, the merits of spending that kind of number, and should we take that number seriously? And we have a $20 trillion not deficit, but debt now. Is that the kind of number that we should be spending? Should we take that seriously, or will it be much smaller than that?
Well, that's the nub of the matter. Because when we talk about trillions of dollars, there's a real divide between the administration and those who may not agree. Because we're talking basically about, you know, how to fund that large number, be it $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion, $2 trillion. And there is the left, the Democrats, who by and large want this funded fully by federal spending. But there are other ways to finance our public infrastructure.
Right.
And that is through allowing the private sector to come in, leverage private sector, local and state government resources, so that it's a partnership. And then the leveraging effect can actually help the federal government, our country, to reach that larger number. So if it's $2 trillion, let's go back to the president's original proposal, which is $1 trillion, and then it was 1.5 trillion. You can allow the private sector to come in and fill the gap.
Right.
And there could be a federal share, there can be a state and local share, so it doesn't have to be 100% federal funding. And I think that's where some of the disagreement is.
I think that a lot of people think of infrastructure, particularly when we're talking about a major bill, as being primarily a federal spending issue and a federal responsibility. But
well, you would be amazed at what the federal government funds now. We fund bike trails. We fund local projects. The role of the federal government originally in the interstate commerce, interstate highway days when President Eisenhower first built the infrastructure, the highway system for the country, number one, it had a national security interest. These were huge highways that technically an airplane can land. So there was a national security purpose. And then secondly, interstate commerce. It connected the whole country in this wonderful network of beautifully built interstate highways. That now has changed a great deal, to the extent where the budget of the Department of Transportation far exceeded what it was before, and it now funds a lot of projects within one state. So the interstate and the national security aspect of the federal infrastructure project has changed a great deal.
can you talk a little bit more about the way in which the federal spending is used to help leverage state and local and private lending? As I understand it,
We have a wonderful example out here, the Purple Line in Maryland. Governor Hogan took a great deal of leadership, and he worked with his state people, local governments, and the private sector. And when I talk about the private sector, I'm talking about pension funds. I'm talking about endowment funds. And so he had some of those, private sector interests come in, and they put together a package, and then they came to the federal government, and we funded something like 35%.
right.
So it was an excellent example of a partnership between the public, the private, and within the public sector, it included federal, state, and local governments. So the Purple Line is now, the groundbreaking has occurred, and the extension is now being is underway. And then out on Route 66, this is under Governor McAuliffe, and Governor McAuliffe had also put together a partnership with the federal government, the local and state government. And so extensions and widening of the Route 66 occurred. And that was just a year and a half ago. So these two are great projects, just in this Washington, D.C. area, on how a partnership can be done. And it doesn't have to be fully, funded by the federal government. And the reason is not because the federal government is uncaring. It's that there's a proper role for the federal government, there's a proper role for the state, and there's a proper role for local government. And when there is buy-in, which is what these participation signify, that means the community is together, they're willing to work together. It bodes much better for the project.
There's still there's a lot of spending, a lot of grants given out. I believe that the Department of Transportation has given out $160 or so billion.
Oh, yes.
During your time at the department during this administration to leverage. Obviously,
if you're
people are
gonna
very
talk-
concerned about the way that the money is spent. And I do need to ask you a couple of questions. What do you say to those who say that Kentucky got special treatment in the allocation of money?
Well, my husband has a wonderful sense of humor. He's also an outstanding public servant. And so he responded, and I wasn't there. When asked about this, he said, yes, I was just complaining to the Secretary of Transportation the day before. There are 169 projects, and Kentucky got 5. And he said, I sure hope Kentucky would do better in the future. And also, from a nationwide point of view, Kentucky ranked about 25 in 50 states in terms of
it's about
total
halfway down,
dollars.
The House on Monday very pointedly voted to forbid Department of Transportation funding from being used for personal gain. How do you respond to that?
Well, I agree. I think federal funds should not be used for personal gain. I certainly believe that, and I haven't done anything to the contrary, nor has anybody else within the department.
Right. No, I suspected that was what you would say, that you agree, but nevertheless, it seemed a very pointed thing for them.
Oh, no, it's definitely a political partisan attack, an effort at it, of course.
So on the question of making sure that monies are public monies are well spent, obviously, one of the things that is often said to promote infrastructure spending is that it's referred to often as an investment rather than spending.
That actually changed during President Clinton's era. He was the first one to use the word investment, and it was an effort to sell government spending.
The implication is that infrastructure spending, at least to some extent, pays for itself. Are there really solid ways in which taxpayers can be reassured? In fact, that kind of thing can be quantified. Is there good ways of measuring how effective infrastructure spending is?
There are. We have productivity studies. There are congestion studies, safety studies, of course. And through these measurements, the monies that are spent for safety, we have a safety task force and all that. Currently, there are about 37, still a little bit less than 37,000 people who die in car fatalities. And we have done studies and, of course, participated in efforts to reduce that through various ways. But one effort that we have reduces fatalities by about 500 lives a year. And then in terms of congestion, we know that on average, passengers, ordinary folks spend about 4 hours on the road in congested conditions. They lose about 4 hours a week. So when we invest in infrastructure, we can actually try to reduce that number.
Right.
So there are various ways.
I understand
But
that.
of course, we're always looking at, how can we spend the money wisely, prudently, in a fiscally responsible way. And also, the department is huge. The department's annual budget is about $88 billion, of which about 75 billion are for infrastructure every year. So even though we did not have the infrastructure bill, let me mention 2 things. One is that there was a down payment in the fiscal year 2018-2019 supplement appropriations in which $20 billion extra was given to the department. And so we have used that money in competitively bid grants, in airport improvement grants. And then also, even though the infrastructure proposal has not yet been successful, and again, we always want to do this on a bipartisan basis, there is something called the Surface Reauthorization Act, which is coming up.
Right.
Because the department, works with Congress on every reauthorization. So that's going to expire on September 30th, 2020. And so that would be another vehicle, which is a more familiar vehicle, actually, to members of Congress.
I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, obviously, there's about 5 weeks after that expiration, we'll be having the presidential election. Nevertheless, the FAST Act Renewal is talked about as the most likely vehicle for passing an infrastructure bill. On the other hand, it could be just a renewal of what there is now. How confident are you? Is there a real prospect of getting a substantial infrastructure bill using that vehicle
Well, I always
so close to
hope-
an election?
I always hope that politics won't get in the way, because I think this is really important. It's for the American people. But we also know that sometimes that happens. So the FAST Act that ended in, that was passed in December of 2015 was the first 5-year reauthorization bill in a very, very long, since the 1960s. There have been 16 reauthorizations, like in as many years. I mean, so the general pattern is, in fact, to just have extensions, not full reauthorizations.
Right.
But clearly, the certainty of having a longer time frame is very important to those who are involved in infrastructure. State and local governments, if they know they're going to have this money for 5 years rather than 6 months, they can actually plan for the future. So a longer-term horizon is better.
Yeah, assuming, as I think probably most people do assume, that there's not going to be a major infrastructure bill. Or,
Well, I haven't given up hope yet. The president's optimistic.
I'm sure a lot of, well,
and the
I'm
White
sure-
House they're talking to Congress about this.
Let's just say then, hypothetically, if it doesn't get done, how much is being discussed in the run-up to the 2020 elections about making infrastructure a central part of the president's re-election campaign?
I haven't been involved in those discussions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think that it would be a wise thing to do in that there is bipartisan agreement? There was polling which was referred to in an earlier panel today that spending on infrastructure, on highways, on road improvements, etc., is popular in states that the president will want to win.
I don't really get involved in discussions like that. It's really above my pay grade. But I will say, I mean, look, there is a new governor of Michigan, and she had a slogan. I'm not going to repeat the whole thing because there's a curse word in there. But she says, "Fix the X roads." So infrastructure is important. But I don't get involved in the campaign and what they talk about and anything like that. I have, I take care of the Department of Transportation. It's a department I love. I've been back in this department 3 times. I was first a deputy maritime administrator, then I was a deputy secretary, and it's been wonderful coming back. But what has revealed to me, what I've learned since coming back, is mission creep. That every time I come back after 8 or some odd years, the department's mission expands, and it changes. So the government is getting bigger, I think pretty much in all the departments.
Right. One of the things that, when one is talking about, when a huge amount of money is, whether it's $1 trillion or some other number, is agreed to be spent, there's always the possibility that that amount of spending and an enormous number of construction projects will push up the cost of labor, the cost of resources. In order to make sure that the tax dollars are spent in a judicious and cautious way, do you think that that infrastructure spending and construction need to be phased in so that costs do not rise? Is that one of the things that you would consider?
We like this phrase, the president likes this phrase, which is under budget, ahead of schedule.
Right.
And we actually look at the timeline and the budget of various projects that compete for the build grants and for the infra grants. We look at the track record of the community. We look at the project, what the timelines are, what the probability is that it will come in on time, on target in terms of the budget. So that is a factor when we give out these discretionary grants.
Nicole Gelinas, who was on an earlier panel, wrote a cover story for the Washington Examiner magazine just a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things that she proposed was that the Department of Transportation do a sort of a grading system so that there is rewards going to people who are getting things done on time and on budget, and that sort of productivity index is used to focus where money is spent. Is that something that you might do?
We have something like that at the department, clearly, with federal highways, federal transit, which give out an incredible number of grants. But now federal railways, in fact, is giving out grants. So this is an example of where previously Federal Railroad was only involved in safety, not so much in grant making, but now Federal Railroad is as well. But Federal Highways is used to making lots and lots of, giving out lots and lots of money.
Right.
It's through formula. So they have they keep track of how the money is spent. There are audits afterwards to make sure that that the money went where it's supposed to go. So it's not precisely her idea, but there are checks and balances. But we always are interested in ensuring that, we do a good job, the department does a good job in giving out the money on a formula basis, as dictated by Congress, but that the money is used wisely.
So let's turn our attention to the innovation agenda at the Department of Transportation.
Very exciting.
There are an enormous number of things that the Department of Transportation acts as a kind of facilitator and isn't always just handing out grants, it has to regulate. And the first thing that I wanted to...
Actually, may I just interrupt?
Yes, please.
Okay, so we have 3 priorities at the department. The first priority is safety. We are first and foremost a regulatory agency on safety, ensuring safety in transportation modes, except for maritime. The Maritime Administration is a promotional agency, and it's different from all the others. And it's only U.S. flag, which is a very distinct and unique kind of trade. But for in other modes, I always say that a good day is when nothing bad happens. Nothing falls out of the skies, nothing falls, out of the tracks. So first and foremost, safety must be number 1. Number 2, we want to address the deteriorating infrastructure because infrastructure has impact on economic vitality, productivity, quality of life. And the third priority is we've got to be preparing for the future because there's so many exciting transportation technologies that are emerging. And the government's role, our role at the Department of Transportation, is to engage with these new emerging technologies to address legitimate public concerns about safety, security, and privacy without hampering innovation.
Well, let's talk about
That's
one
a
of
balance.
those. Let's talk about one of those, and
Yes.
that's drones. I was astonished to read that there are now 1.5 million drone pilots in the country, and presumably that number is growing every day. What is the Department of Transportation doing to monitor and regulate drones at the same time as to encourage it to go back to your...
Well, we are actually in the midst of laying the foundation and the framework for future technology advancement, while always remembering our responsibility in ensuring safety. There are a lot of concerns about security because, as we have seen recently, drones have appeared in places where they're not supposed to be, and they can be weaponized.
Right.
So there's a security aspect. So the military and the law enforcement officials and agencies are very concerned about this. And so we work with them as to how we can regulate the drones. And the FAA reauthorization took a bit more time because of the need for different stakeholders within the government even to come to a protocol about what to do on the security front with drones. And then thirdly, we get and I hear all the time from consumers who don't like drones, the thought of drones peeking through their windows.
Right.
So there are privacy concerns as well. And so we're actually laying doing really revolutionary work in terms of asking for public input. We held a UAV, autonomous vehicles summit last year. It was headed up by the Undersecretary of Policy, Derek Kahn, and many other forums in which we're seeking input from the public. So we have a number of rulemakings now ongoing that would allow eventually depending on input, drones flying over the heads of people outside the line of sight and at night. We also have autonomous vehicles proving grounds. That's autonomous vehicles.
Let me just interrupt for a second about the drones. Historically, technological innovations have always alarmed people, but it's very easy to understand alarm relating to drones. I mean, Iran shot a drone down the other day. They are machines which can be and are weaponized. There are also ads on TV for pizza being delivered by a drone. So there's an enormous range of uses for drones. People don't like the idea of snooping, and are we going to, in other words, have your inquiries already produced some answers? Are we going to see, as it were, flight paths for drones, as there are for aeroplanes? And how can the public be assured that with 1.5 million drone pilots in the country, presumably rising to 2 million fairly soon, what actual practical steps are already in mind to do
So
this?
these rulemakings are enormously important in seeking public input and also stakeholder input. The government is not the fountain of all wisdom. So we are not the ones to decide which technology. We're not top-down, command and control, because frankly, to rely upon the federal government in this field where technology is changing so rapidly is truly frightening. But what we can do, obviously, is to provide the forum through which public input and relevant stakeholders can voice their opinion. That's the rulemaking process. We also have another 2 initiatives that would also talk about remote ID identification. How do we identify remotely all these things that are flying about? And then even a more essential question, as drones get bigger, more powerful, we need to safely integrate them into the national airspace, which is run by the FAA. So all these very serious questions are being considered by the FAA and by our policy shop as we go forward, and also NHTSA and the autonomous vehicles.
And to put that in real layman's terms, that's to make sure that the drone is not being flown by an enemy.
Absolutely. There's a security issue.
Transponder or something like that on the machine.
And also but drones are used also for so many ways in which we had not expected. Pipeline safety inspections, remote inspections of energy grids. In the recent California fires, drones flew in to survey what was going on. In the aftermath of hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, drones were used in Puerto Rico to look at the aftermath, devastation, and what the state of repairs were that were needed.
Well, I was going to ask you about that.
And then also, there's another thing. There are now 435,000 drone operators. This is a category that did not exist 5 years ago. I was a Secretary of Labor. Let me tell you, in 2008, when I left, there was not any mention of a drone operator as a category.
Given that drones are very useful in inspecting infrastructure and where there has been damage, can we expect the Department of Transportation to have its own fleet of drones to inspect national infrastructure?
I had not thought about that. As you well know, the FAA does have some planes for precisely this purpose. And so we'll have to see. That's very interesting.
So I'm going to turn to another area which I understand the Department of Transportation has been doing a lot of work on, and that is rocketry. Until fairly recently, the United States was lagging in 4th place behind the EU, China, and Russia in the field of commercial rocket launches. But as I understand it, it's now back to the #1 position. So what has the Department of Transportation done to streamline the permitting for reusable rockets? And, tell us a little bit about that work.
So you're exactly right. Now, commercial space, the United States is #1 in commercial space once again. And there are 2 things that are happening. #1, when the president came in, he set up the Space Council, and the vice president, who has a real personal interest and passion for this, is the chairman. So the Space Council has done wonderful work in coordinating agency-wide the work of the whole government and permitting reform at the Department of Transportation is certainly a major issue. There was a rulemaking that was initiated, and we are decreasing the number of duplicative, overly burdensome regulations, making it easier to have one-stop shop. Number two, it was Americans who made the relaunchable rocket a reality. So with the advent of the relaunchable, reusable rocket, that decreased the cost of using commercial space and really was a boon to the industry, thus helping to contribute to America's preeminence.
It's just staying up in the air, or at least I assume still up in the air, that you're also doing some work to encourage supersonic flight and making testing easier for new technology. Could you tell us a little bit in concrete terms what's being done there?
Well, that's also the FAA, and there are new starts that are thinking about restoring and bringing back supersonic flights. Obviously, safety would be a huge concern. Noise would be a second. And so the FAA makes itself available to these new entrepreneurs and new technology stakeholders to come and work early in the process with the FAA so that the FAA knows what's going on, and then these new innovators will get a better idea as to what the regulators want. So we encourage very early participation and collaboration.
Tell us a little bit about the...
collaboration may be a bad word, but they need to let the regulators know so they're not going
Right.
way off stream, and the regulators can tell them very early, this is the right way, this is the wrong way.
Right. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about the Technology Council that you set up. I understand
yes.
in March. It's not something that I think has got an enormous amount of press, but tell us a little bit about its work. What's its mission? What is its mission and what does it do?
Well, we've been hearing a lot about Hyperloop. And in fact, I spoke with the former mayor of Chicago when he was in office about his plan to have a Hyperloop built between city center Chicago and O'Hare. And so as we began to talk about that, I realized that the Department of Transportation is structured in a very siloed way. I don't think it would be a surprise to anyone. And so with the advent of new technology, we don't really have a place that can respond to informational requests from people who want to know what the government's role is and what will the Department of Transportation do. So just as to take Hyperloop as an example, there are a number of competitors, it's a brand name, and it goes underground. It's kind of like a transit system. So Federal Transit would be involved. It involves rail cars, so Federal Railways would be involved. It's in a vacuum tube, so FAA would be involved. And then you also need environmental impact statements, which means that the highway system, Federal Highways would be involved. So given that all these groups will be involved, these departments within the Department of Transportation didn't know what their responsibilities were.
Right.
And because it was new, it was kind of intimidating too. So we set up this new emerging Transportation Technology Council that would bring all the heads of these various offices together and provide a one-place shop for new and emerging technology innovators to come and ask, how do they proceed? What do they have to do? How do they fulfill all the regulatory requirements? Because that is very necessary. They just can't, we're all for innovation, but innovation within guidelines of safety, security, and privacy. So that's how this concept began, and we have found it to be absolutely amazing in terms of the reception. I just saw someone from Hyperloop yesterday, and they were just so enthusiastic and excited about they not having to figure out how we work,
Right.
but be able to go to one place with people who know what they're talking about and advise them responsibly on what the regulators require.
Right.
So.
Madam Secretary, I know that the time is tight, and we're sort of running out of time. I wanted to give you the opportunity to make some news.
I never try to make news.
I'm told that. But coming back to the question of how things should be,
I'm interested in giving out information.
Right.
And I'm interested in empowering others so that they have the information to act. And we actually try to be very transparent and very responsive.
I wanted to ask you really just about
Sure.
paying for.
But I'm not a
come back
media
to the money.
hound.
No. All right, you're not. Should the gas tax be raised?
Well, that has certainly been a topic of discussion, and the president has talked about it. Certain Republicans and Democrats. I think that's it's a larger issue connected to what are we going to do in our infrastructure bill. Let's decide on that first, and then we will also come to how are we going to fund it, how are we going to pay for it, how are we going to finance it. There are lots of different ways.
And one of the ways that it's being suggested is undoing some of the tax cuts. Is that also on the table?
I think that probably is not on the table. Yeah. But clearly, how to pay for, how to finance our infrastructure needs is a huge issue, and we really want it to be on a bipartisan basis.
Right.
Because this is something that every American cares about.
Right. With that, I think that we've come to the end of our time, Madam Secretary. I just wanted to thank you very much for joining us, and I would ask the audience to join me in thanking the Secretary.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much. Thanks very much indeed. That's it for today. I hope you'll all come back to our policy discussions. We have these events every so often, and please look out for the next announcements on the next ones. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks so much.